We are just at 5 o'clock. I see a few people out in the hallway, so I'm going to give us 1 more minute. As we wait for folks to get comfortable, we do have handouts on that card table right as you walk in. You're welcome to take them home with you. And we also have index cards. So those cards are for you if you want to ask any questions anonymously today. You're welcome to write your question or questions on those cards. Raise your hand and our assistant town clerk, Jen, will come grab them for you so we can review and answer them. You're also more than welcome to ask your questions up at the microphone set up in the center of the room.
You want to come down a little bit?
All right, I think we can get started. First off, thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's great to see so many folks in the audience. Most of you are familiar faces, but for anyone I don't know, my name is Emily Mitchell. I'm the town clerk here in Harwich. Also to my right, I'm joined by our assistant town clerk, Jen Clark. And in the back of the room, we have Marissa El-Sahrawi, our executive assistant. So our full town clerk's office is represented here this evening. We're very excited to have you all with us. So this event is called Trust the Process, and it's designed to cover anything and everything about election-related processes. Do you want to wait for a second? Can everyone hear me okay in the back of the room? Okay, I'll keep talking while Jamie makes the speakers work better for me. Oh, one other housekeeping thing, we are being video and audio recorded this evening, just to make sure everyone is aware of that. Restrooms and the water refill station are straight behind you. Exits both ways. Okay, so to jump in, this event, Trust the Process, on all things election administration. We know there are a lot of questions and comments and concerns sort of in the public sphere about how elections are run, all of the various voting methods, how election results are certified, how election security is maintained. So we're here tonight to talk with you about all of those different topics. We're prepared to talk about voting methods, voting equipment, voter list maintenance, accessible voting, result certification, and really any other topics that are of interest to you. We are here for about an hour, and because we're a small enough group, I'd love it to be kind of more responsive to what you're interested in. So it is an information session, but it's also really, I think, primarily a Q&A. So to start, is there any topic that any of you are most particularly interested in or that you hear most about when you're out in the community? Anything? Yes, Chris.
How the census relates to maintaining your voting privilege.
Excellent. Okay, so Chris says her question or what she hears in the community is about how the annual local census contributes to the development and maintenance of our voter list. So I'm going to skip ahead a few slides to information on voter lists, and I'll start talking about that. So voter lists are maintained in a couple of different ways. Primarily, information is submitted and entered into a database right through your local town clerk's office. And our voter lists and the annual census include information for both voters and also residents of the town of Harwich. So to become a registered voter, you do have to meet certain qualifying criteria. You do have to be a United States citizen. You have to be 18 years of age or older. And in the state of Massachusetts, you cannot currently be incarcerated for a felony conviction. It's also important to note that you can only register to vote in one place, and that place has to be where you actually reside. So that's something that does come into play in Harwich and other Cape area communities where many of our homes are owned by second homeowners, so non-resident taxpayers. And those folks would not be eligible typically to register to vote in our community because they don't reside here. This is not their permanent ongoing residence. So they would register to vote in their primary community. So the only folks who should be registered to vote in Harwich are folks who reside here, who consider this their primary and permanent residence. So folks can register to vote in a number of ways. They can submit a hard copy application to our office, either in person or by mail. They can also register to vote online through the Secretary of State's website. And then the fourth way that folks can register is through automatic voter registration. And that's typically what you see from the Registry of Motor Vehicles. So if you go to renew your driver's license, register a vehicle, you complete a transaction at the RMV, now the town clerk's office automatically receives a new voter registration request from you. So the RMV is the primary agency that participates in this automatic voter registration, but there are other state agencies that participate as well. Certain state benefits like Mass Health participate, the Department of Transitional Assistance participates, anyone who signs up for health insurance through the Health Connector, your information can be transmitted to the town clerk's office. So those are all considered automatic voter registration, and the information you transmit as part of your transaction at those agencies is then sent directly from the agency to your local town clerk's office. Now the process doesn't just end there, you're not automatically registered. When we receive that information in our office, we review it, and we see, is this person already a registered voter in our community? Which does often happen, right? Usually folks register when they turn 18 or when they move to town, not necessarily in tandem with registering a vehicle or getting a driver's license. So oftentimes, folks who go to an agency and have their voter information transmitted to us are already registered in town. And in that case, we identify that new submission from the agency as a duplicate, and we reject the new registration. So your original registration already on file with the town is maintained. You'll receive a notice from us indicating that your voter registration has been rejected as a duplicate, and we get a lot of calls from folks wondering why they're getting that notice in the mail and wondering if they've been removed from the voter rolls. You have not. It just means that we see that you are already registered in the town, and your new request, the one that came through the agency, has been rejected. So those are the 4 ways that folks get added to the voter list. And then there are other ways that we maintain that list, and that's where I'm going to be able to get to Chris's question. So we do a lot of work in the town clerk's office to maintain the accuracy of our voter list. So one way that we do that is through the annual census. If folks are residents here in Harwich, you'll notice that you receive an annual census or annual street listing from our office, the town clerk's office, every January. That is a form that lists everyone in your household, and you are asked to verify the accuracy of that list and or make any edits right on that census form, sign it, and then return it to our office. So when you do that, that helps us keep the list accurate. So maybe you have a new baby in the household, or maybe you've gotten married and your spouse is new to the household. Anything really can change in the makeup of your household that you would indicate on that census form. The census form cannot be used to register you to vote, so you can't use the census in lieu of one of those other 4 registration methods, but it is a way to help maintain accuracy. What happens if you don't return that annual census? I'm sure, again, some of you may be familiar with that. If you don't respond within the required timeline under the statute, so we send it to you in January, if you don't return it to us by June of that same calendar year, we're required to transition your voter status from active to inactive. So your status becomes inactive. You're still a registered voter, so we still have your voter information on file in the town clerk's office. Your status is changed to inactive. When that happens, we send you another notice indicating you've been made inactive, and you can return that to reactivate you. But otherwise, this is one of the situations where if you've been made inactive, and then it comes to election day and you go to your polling place looking to vote, you're going to be flagged on the voter list as inactive, and you have to take a few additional steps right there at the polls to reactivate you before you can go ahead and vote. So what happens if you become inactive is that you would be required to show identification at the polls, and you're also required to swear an oath called an affirmation of current and continuous residence, which is basically just saying, I do live at this address where I'm registered, and I have lived there since I last submitted some paperwork indicating that I live there. So you have to do both of those things, show identification and swear that oath, and then we're able to reactivate you right there at the polls and allow you to proceed to vote. So that's sort of the primary way that the voter list and the annual street listing interact with one another. If you are made inactive and then you don't vote in 2 consecutive biennial state elections, so the 2 November elections, for example, the presidential election this November and then the midterm election in November 2026, at that point you could be fully removed from the voter rolls. So it's an extended process to be removed from the voter rolls based on census non-response, but it is possible and it does help us keep those voter lists clean from folks who have moved out of our community. Other ways that we capture moves and we keep our voter list active, the state database that we use is called VRIS, which stands for Voter Registration Information System. I'm going to call it VRIS right from going forward because Voter Registration Information System is a mouthful, but VRIS is that voter database. So it is a statewide database. So conveniently, if someone is registered in Harwich and then they move to another community within the state of Massachusetts, so let's say they move from Harwich to Dennis and they register to vote in Dennis. Because each community within the state is connected, when they register in Dennis, they are automatically pulled from the Harwich voter list. So intra-state moves don't require the voter to take any action to remove themselves from their prior community. So registering in the new community with their same, name and date of birth allows the database, the central database, to recognize those profiles as a duplicate and to remove the voter from the prior community. And when that happens, both communities send the voter a notice. So the new community, in this example, Dennis, sends the voter a notice saying, we confirm and acknowledge that you've registered to vote in the town of Dennis. And Harwich sends them a notice saying, we confirm that you have been removed from the Harwich voter rolls. So if that were ever in error, the voter is getting 2 notices to flag for them that they might want to take corrective action. So that option is available to them. Other ways that we maintain the voter lists, another question we get a lot is what happens with deceased voters. So in the town clerk's office, we are also the office that processes vital records. So your vital records are your births, marriages, and deaths. So as the town clerk's office, we automatically receive, through the vital records database, information about individuals who either pass away within the confines of the town of Harwich, or individuals who are residents of Harwich and passed away anywhere else in the state of Massachusetts. So for example, if you're a resident of Harwich, but maybe you pass away at a hospital or a nursing home, we do still get that notification. And when we get that notification that a voter has passed, we do automatically remove them from the voter rolls. The family doesn't need to take any additional action in those 2 cases. So if the voter passed away within the confines of the town, or if the voter was a resident of Harwich and passed away elsewhere in Massachusetts. It's another database that is standardized across the state and linked across the state. So if someone is a resident of Harwich and passes away outside of Massachusetts, that is a situation where we do rely on family or next of kin to notify us. So we do ask family members or friends or whomever is kind of dealing with that post-end-of-life paperwork and things to notify their local town clerk's office to make sure that they have sufficient documentation to remove someone. And if that doesn't happen, then they typically get removed via that census process. So if someone is on the street listing, of course, if you are deceased, you're not responding to the street listing, and then they would get removed in the ordinary course of that street listing process. So the vast majority of voters who have passed are caught because we are the keeper of those vital records, but we do, again, rely on family or next of kin notification in those other situations. Any other questions on voter list maintenance while we're on this topic? Yes, Dan.
First of all, thank you and your staff for making yourself available for this type of information. How about the NCOA, the National address database. Do you use that at all with the voter list?
We are not allowed by law to use the NCOA list for voter registration amendments. So no, we do not.
Okay, and what about Eric? Are you associated with Eric? Also?
Yes. So the state of Massachusetts is a member of ERIC. Mentioned it on one of these slides. So ERIC stands for Electronic Registration Information Center, and it is an organization that states have to decide to become a member of. So Massachusetts is one of 24 member states. The District of Columbia is also a member, and this is a tool for states to share voter registration information with other member states. So it's periodically, I believe it's every 60 days, that the member states transmit information about voters to the other states. So when you register to vote, you indicate the address where you live, and then you also indicate any prior addresses. So through ERIC, if someone moves to, say, Vermont, I'm assuming Vermont is a member state, I should have verified before the example, but let's say, for the sake of example, that Vermont is a member state. If someone moves to Vermont and they indicate a Harwich address as one of their prior addresses, then on that periodic, I think it's 60-day basis, Vermont sends notification to the Secretary of State's office, the Massachusetts Secretary of State's office, and then the Secretary of State's office trickles that down to the local communities. So we'll receive information from the Secretary of State's office saying, you can remove these voters, they're now registered at this address in another state. So it's a great tool for the member states. I wish there was something that was country-wide, but it is great for the 24 member states, including Massachusetts.
So going back to the requirements to vote, I'm wondering if you could address how new voters, when they register with you, how you and your staff verify that they meet all three requirements, because the big thing in the news lately is about citizenship and people voting that shouldn't be, so. if you could
Absolutely.
share that.
So when folks register to vote, they do have again, either a form or an online version of the form, essentially, where they register to vote. The first two questions ask, are you a U.S. citizen, and are you 18 years of age or older? You then fill in the biographical information. And then the last thing you do is you sign, and it's in big, large letters, that you're signing under the pains and penalties of perjury, that all the information you have provided is correct. So that is the standard that is set under federal law. That's the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. So that is what governs all of the different state-level voter registration, is saying that voters must attest under the pains and penalties of perjury that they meet all of the eligibility requirements to register to vote. So that's the legal standard. We do have other ways where we verify voter information, but again, the standard is really just that you have attested under the pains and penalties of perjury that you are eligible. When you complete your voter registration paperwork, you are asked to provide either the last 4 digits of your social security number, or in Massachusetts to provide either your Massachusetts state ID or Massachusetts driver's license number on the form. And then we enter that information, including that identification number, into VRIS, our voter registration database. And that number, whichever you enter, is verified, either against the Social Security Administration records, if you've entered the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, or against the Registry of Motor Vehicles, if you've entered in your state ID or driver's license number. If you're registering to vote online through the Secretary of State's website, you're only able to complete an online voter registration if you have an active Registry of Motor Vehicles file, including an electronic signature on file. So those online submissions are checked against the Registry of Motor Vehicles database. And then if you are registering via automatic registration, so the state agencies that you're engaging with for other services, and then your information is transmitted to us, state agencies can only participate in automatic voter registration if they collect information sufficient to verify citizenship as part of your transaction there. So that's typically a US passport, social security card, or birth certificate. So you have to provide that information to the agency for the agency to be allowed to transmit that information to us as your local town clerk's office. So again, the legal standard is attesting under the pains and penalties of perjury, but the practice is essentially that everyone is verified by having those numbers checked against the appropriate databases that collect citizenship information. Now, if you register to vote and you leave that ID number, that field blank when you register to vote, you will be prompted to show identification the first time that you come to vote in Massachusetts. So those are the various ways. And we do know that the citizenship topic is definitely one of the most salient topics right now. And as I was putting this material together for today, I was going through a lot of research done by other organizations. So this has been studied extensively by nonprofits, think tanks, academics, state level, Secretary of State and equivalent in other communities, attorneys general, town clerk's offices, and really across the board, folks are finding that people who are not U.S. citizens are not registering to vote. If anyone is inadvertently registered to vote, that none of those votes are having any kind of discernible impact on election results. Does that answer your question, Karen, about citizenship verification? Okay. Anyone else have questions on voter list maintenance while we're on this topic? Yes?
If a state is not a member of ERIC, how do you know somebody's not voting in Florida, and assuming Florida isn't in ERIC, how do you know somebody's not voting in two different places?
So that is an area where we do rely on voters to be good people. Where they're registering to vote, they are attesting under the pains and penalties of perjury that they live here, they are eligible to vote there. Failure to do so is a felony. It is investigated and persecuted by local district attorneys. So that is sort of the enforcement mechanism. But it is a gap. I freely admit that the fact that there's no nationwide way of comparing voter rolls is an area for improvement, I would say. Yes?
Which driver's license do you require that people show? The one with the star in the corner, or just the driver's license?
Just a driver's license. It does have to be, so the question was which driver's license do you have to show? It has to be a Massachusetts issued driver's license, so it can't be a Florida driver's license because it has to be compared to the Registry of Motor Vehicles database. So even non-real ID driver's licenses tie back to that RMV database, and at the RMV they collect that biographical, including citizenship information. So regardless of whether it is a real ID or not, the database has the necessary information for voter registration verification purposes.
Well, it's my understanding you don't need to provide a birth certificate or other valid proof of citizenship with the standard driver's license, only with the one with the star that was
Real
upgraded.
ID.
So the question was that you don't, or the comment was that you don't necessarily need to provide proof of citizenship when you are at the RMV if you're not securing a real ID, and that is correct, and then in that case that number wouldn't be sufficient. So when we say verifiable, that number wouldn't be able to verify someone as a U.S. citizen. They would be prompted to show identification at the polls. But again, the standard, the legal standard, is that someone attests under the pains and penalties of perjury that they are eligible to register to vote. So if someone signs that document, checks that box, and signs that document, then they have met the federal standard to register to vote, that they are indicating under the pains and penalties of perjury with their signature that they are eligible to vote. So that is the legal standard. Yes?
Why don't you have to show an ID when you're registering to vote?
Yeah, great question. So the question was, why don't you have to show ID when you register to vote? And that is because of the interplay between our voter registration database and the Social Security Administration database and the Registry of Motor Vehicles database. So you are required to provide an identification number. That number is entered into the database and is verified against those two sources depending on which number you enter. And if you don't provide one of those two numbers, so a Massachusetts issued ID or a Social Security number, you are prompted to show ID the first time you vote in the state of Massachusetts. Any other voter list questions? These are great. Okay. Chris started us off asking about the census. Does anyone else have a particular topic of interest? Again, we're talking about election equipment, accessible voting, result certification, methods of voting. So we did talk about vote by mail, in-person early voting, voting on election day.
The results certification process is something that interests me.
Excellent. So the topic of interest was on results certification. So I'm going to skip ahead. It's the last thing I have on my presentation. So you will always notice that your town clerk in your community will announce unofficial results on election night. We'll announce them verbally at the polling place, and then typically we report them to news agencies and on our own websites or in our own offices on election night. We are always careful to call those results unofficial because there's always a little bit more information we need to gather or verify after election night to make sure our results are accurate before we can certify them as final and official. So there are a few things that are involved in that. On election day, some folks have to vote what's called a provisional ballot. So if you come to the polls on election day, you go to check in with our team of election workers, and they cannot find your name on the voter list. In Harwich, they're going to send you up to the information table, which has staff. If anyone's from other communities, you may end up talking to someone called the precinct warden. But essentially, you're going to talk to whomever is in charge at that precinct. And they're going to ask you, do you believe you should be registered in this town at this address? And if someone answers yes to that question, they vote what is called a provisional ballot. So they are given a ballot and a dedicated envelope, and they go and they complete their ballot. They don't check in because their name is not on the voter list. And then they bring that back up to us, again in Harwich, at the information table. In other communities, it might be to the precinct warden. We secure that ballot in an envelope, and that ballot is segregated from all other ballots that are counted on election day. And then in the days following the election, our office investigates that ballot. So sometimes someone might indicate, I went to the registry of motor vehicles, my information should have been transmitted to your community via the automatic voter registration process. I believe that I was registered to vote when I completed that transaction on such and such a date. And so we actually do what's called an RMV inquiry. So we reach out to the RMV and see, do you have any record of completing a transaction with this person that should have resulted in their information being transmitted to us through the automatic voter registration process? So that's one way. Sometimes, that's probably the most common. I'm having a hard time thinking of a reason. Sometimes someone thinks they submitted, a hard copy voter registration form, and if they can produce any record of that in the days to follow and bring that in to us, we would consider that. So if we can find documentation that confirms that that person should have been registered to vote on election day, we can modify our voter list so we can add them to our voter list, backdated to the date that we have documentation indicating they should have been a registered voter, and we count that ballot, and then the election results are adjusted based on those ballots. If we cannot verify that that person should have been a registered voter as of election day, so we inquire with the RMV, we check our internal office records, and there's nothing that indicates that that person was registered by the voter registration deadline in our community, then we would not count the ballot and it would be destroyed. So we have a few days after the election to resolve those provisional ballots. Other things that we do in those days is double check our write-in tally sheet. So all write-in votes are manually tallied. We have to go through and see Emily had 3 votes for town clerk and Jen had 2 votes for senator, and those are all manually tallied. So we make sure that we've totaled those and adjusted our final results correctly. As you can imagine, as it gets late into the evening on election night, we don't necessarily want to rely on the brain power from then. We want to double check our information. Other things that are applicable specifically to our November state elections, so including our upcoming presidential election and also the midterm November elections, there is a later deadline for receiving ballots that are voted by mail. So for those elections only, those November state elections, a ballot can be properly received and counted if it is postmarked by Election Day, and if it's mailed within the United States, it can be received up to 3 days after Election Day. And if it's mailed from outside the United States, it can be received up to 10 days after Election Day. So that's specifically for our military voters and for our U.S. citizens who are residing outside the confines of the United States. So we do have to wait for those ballots to come in, even if we don't receive any. So say no one, that doesn't apply to you, we didn't receive any 3 days or 10 days later. We still have to wait for that period just in case we were to receive them. And if we do receive them, we do count them. That counting is done at a publicly posted session that is available and open to the public for observation. And then the tallies from those mailed ballots that are received after Election Day are added to the totals from election night, and they are included in the official results that are certified as the final results for that election. So it does take longer, so when we're thinking about the presidential election that is upcoming in November, it's going to take about 15 days after Election Day for final results to be certified, and that's because of that process, because we're resolving provisional ballots, and we're waiting for those mailed ballots to come back to us, potentially from within the United States or outside the United States. So it takes a little bit longer for those elections, but we do, once we've checked all of our numbers, we've resolved those provisionals, we've received any additional ballots, we do finally submit and certify those official results. Any other questions on results certification? Yes?
Yeah, do you have somebody that's just responsible for on the mailing ballots, checking the signatures on the envelope versus the signature on the ballot?
We don't have a dedicated person to do that, no. So the statute has town clerk's offices check the signature on the envelope, and I have a sample. Maybe before I answer the question, I should walk through what a vote by mail ballot contains. So for folks who choose to vote by mail, you first must apply to vote by mail. So not everyone is mailed a ballot. You do have to apply for a mailed ballot requesting one, and you indicate which elections you want to receive mailed ballots for. So the first step for vote by mail is to submit an application. And then once you submit an application, you are mailed a ballot kit that looks like this. So this is the outer envelope that you receive from our office. And inside, the kit contains a few things. It includes a postage prepaid return envelope so that you can return your completed ballot materials to us. It contains this brownish color security envelope, so this is what you place your marked ballot inside of, and you seal this closed, and you are required to sign the top of it. If you don't sign it, we do reject your ballot, and we have to send you another one. Your kit will also include a ballot. Because the September election is a primary, the ballots do vary by party, so I have sample ballots of all 3 party ballot styles that are available. The 3 recognized political parties in the state of Massachusetts as of 2024 are the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the Libertarian Party, so the ballots are different. If you're a registered voter in one of those parties, you will automatically receive that party's ballot. You're only eligible to vote the party ballot of the party you are formally affiliated with. If you are an unenrolled voter, which is the term we typically use, or a lot of folks know as independent, but the technical term in the state of Massachusetts is unenrolled. If you are an unenrolled voter, you have to choose which party's ballot style you want to vote. You indicate that on your application if you're voting by mail, or if you're voting in person, you indicate it when you're checking in with the election workers. So you will have that ballot of whichever the appropriate party ballot style is. So a lot of folks think that mailed ballots, when they are received, that the signature is checked against someone's voter registration, and that is not what happens. It's an application and a security ballot envelope. So we're looking at recent signatures, not someone's signature when they were 18 and they registered to vote when they're voting now as a 65-year-old. I will say we are advised as town clerks that we are not handwriting experts. We don't get any training in handwriting analysis or handwriting comparison. So it would be a very high threshold for us to reject a ballot for mismatched signatures. We have had a small handful of cases where the signatures were different enough that we felt it was appropriate to contact the voter. I think the one time it happened, we found that the voter's parent had signed the envelope, whereas the voter had signed the application. So we rejected the ballot, we sent them a new ballot, and then the voter signed the envelope. So again, we are not, as town clerks, handwriting experts. We do not receive handwriting training. But if there was something where there was a significant mismatch, we would contact the voter, and absent a compelling response from the voter, like in that case it was a very clean cut, mom signed the envelope and we could correct that. It is something we would report to the district attorney's office for investigation for voter fraud. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on, does anyone want me to talk a little bit more about how vote by mail ballots are processed once we receive them? Okay. So we do see a significant uptick in voters who wish to vote by mail. It's something that in Massachusetts was first offered in 2020 in response to the COVID pandemic. It was made permanent as an offering in 2022 via the Votes Act legislation at the state level. So mail voting is now available for all voters in state and federal elections, and is also offered in local elections unless the local select board chooses not to offer it. So it's offered by default for the local, but can be opted out of at the community level, and it's offered guaranteed for all state and federal elections. The town cannot opt out of it. So the process works that a voter completes an application, they file it with our office, we mail the ballot to the voter marks the ballot, and returns it to us. And at all of these stages, the different processes are documented in our voter registration database. So when we receive that application, we record it in the voter registration database. That application itself needs to be signed. If it's not signed, we have to reject the application, and we'll send the voter a new application to their address on file, and we confirm that that person is in fact a registered voter in our community. So we log that the person has requested the ballot. When the ballots become available in our office, we mail them out. We have to assemble these kits, so we do have a handful of election workers in this room, and many of them were involved in preparing those mailed ballot kits. So if you are a voter who is voting by mail in the state primary election, certainly thank the folks in this room for compiling all of these materials to send out to you. So we log when the ballot kit is mailed to you, so we know exactly what date we mailed it to you. We then, when we receive your completed application, it's logged again. So everything is logged in that voter registration database. Your ballot must be secured in this envelope, and the envelope again must be signed. So if you happen to return your ballot in this outer white envelope, we would have to reject it and send you a new one. If you returned it to us in this envelope, but the envelope was not signed, we would have to reject it and send you a new one. But otherwise, if everything is returned properly, we document that. And then the ballots are stored, they remain in this security envelope that is sealed and signed until they are processed for counting. So they get filed typically for a couple weeks from when you return it until we get closer to election day itself. They are stored in our locked and secured vault in the town clerk's office. They're filed by election precinct and voter name. And then they are processed, actually counted, so counted to have their results contributing towards the election outcome in one of three different ways. I'm going to pull up some information on that for reference. So one of three ways that early ballots are counted. In all of the three ways, they are processed with the help of election workers. All of these processes occur in publicly posted sessions that are open to the public for observation. So the public can observe every part of this from start to finish. So one way that happens prior to election day itself is called advanced processing. So when we hold an advanced processing session, and again, this session will be posted and open to the public. We are planning them for next week for the state primary election. Dates and times are to be determined, so be on the lookout on our town clerk's website and physically outside of our office for those postings. But they happen, and we have basically teams of election workers process these ballots in batches. So they go precinct by precinct. So we'll bring up, for example, all of the precinct 1 mailed ballots received to date. And then teams of election workers work in partnership to check in, basically act on the voter's behalf, to check in that voter on the voter list based on the information that is printed on this envelope. So the voter's full name and their residential address where they are registered to vote are on this envelope. So they use that information to check the voter in on the voter list. They do that in batches. So let's say we do 10 or 15 voters who we've checked in on the voter list. They then open the ballot, so unseal this outer envelope, remove the ballot that is inside, and this is why we do it in batches so they can be removed and shuffled to maintain voter privacy. And then they are actually processed through precinct tabulators or a high-speed scanner. So those are two different pieces of election equipment. They are both used to actually count ballots to produce results. We have a precinct tabulator here, so maybe I'll describe that next for folks. But essentially, in either way, whether they're using a precinct tabulator or a high-speed scanner, the early ballots are placed into those machines and counted. They are using designated memory cards, memory media that are programmed for advanced processing. They produce their own set of results from those advanced processing sessions. And then on election night, we don't actually get to view those results until election night. We can't run the report from the memory cards until polls close on election night. But when they close, we run those results reports from the early sessions, and we add those results to the results from the precincts from the in-person election day voters to produce the final results for the election. So that's how advanced processing works for early voted ballots. And when that session is complete, so the ballot is put through the precinct tabulator or the high-speed scanner, which again I'll describe in much greater detail in a moment, those ballots are counted, so they don't need to go anywhere else. They get sealed in ballot boxes with seals affixed to them, they're labeled, and then they're stored in our vault for their retention period. So for state and federal elections, we maintain those ballots for a period of 22 months. For local elections, they're retained for at least 30 days. So they're counted, no additional action needs to be taken with those ballots. They are sealed and they are stored. Did I see a question?
Yeah, who were the election poll watchers, or what are these people?
Election workers, are you asking who election workers are? Sure, so election workers are the either paid or volunteer folks who are trained and sworn in and certified to assist with elections. So majority of election workers, their names are submitted to the select board for appointment as election workers, and that happens on an annual basis. I, as the town clerk, also have the authority to appoint election workers, and then they all go through training. They're sworn into the faithful performance of their duties, and then they perform those duties.
I think you might have been asking about poll watchers.
Are you asking about poll watchers, like observers?
No, well, no, you were explaining the ballot process.
Yes.
How you want to get on that list of people.
Sure, so if you're...
I wanted to do that, how would I do it?
Okay, excellent question. So we're asking how someone becomes an election worker. So those two processes, the names that go before the select board are submitted to the select board from the two local party committees. So the Harwich Republican Town Committee or the Harwich Democratic Town Committee. So if you're a member of either of those town committees, you should express interest to the chair of that respective committee, and they'll add you to the list of names that is submitted to the select board for appointment. If you're not a member of one of those two town committees or you're an unenrolled voter, reach out to me. I always meet with election workers, either one-on-one, potential election workers one-on-one or in a small group. They all have to go through certain training before they perform their duties, but I do have the authority to make appointments, and we're always looking for new folks to join our team. Not necessarily for September and probably even November because of the training that's required, but we are always welcome new election workers on a rolling basis, so depending on which kind of avenue is most appropriate to you, that's how folks would become election workers. Did you have another question, or were you just clarifying? Okay. Yes?
I apologize if I missed this. Is the early ballots the same as just the mail-in ballots? So it's the mail-in ballots that come in before the deadline for the election?
Yes, so this question was, what exactly are early ballots? The vast majority of the early ballots are those that are submitted by mail, the mail ballots. We do also have something called in-person early voting, so that's when folks can come to the town clerk's office, either the week or 2 weeks, depending on the election, before election day to vote. And you come in and you check, you don't need to apply in advance for in-person early voting, but when you leave, you do secure your envelope, your ballot in a similar envelope, so you secure it in this brown security envelope that is signed and sealed, and so the in-person early ballots are counted the same way, so they can be counted as part of that advanced processing session. The other two options for counting early voted ballots are either at a central tabulation facility on election day or on election day at the actual precincts. So a central tabulation facility is basically advanced processing but on election day rather than before election day. It's a place to centrally process early ballots rather than bringing them to the precincts. Or some ballots are processed actually at the individual precinct. So in the precinct lines that are set up in the community center gymnasium on election day, you might notice election workers bringing a stack of envelopes to the check-in table. They check in the voter right at that check-in table on the election day voter list. They'll bring their batch to check out. Similar process, check out with a team of election workers at the checkout table, and then again remove the ballots and batches and place them in the precinct tabulator. So those are the three different ways that early ballots are processed. Taking a quick look at time, I think I have enough time to go through the election equipment, especially seeing as I just named some equipment by name without describing in great detail. So in the town clerk's office, we do use a variety of types of equipment. On the list I have up here, you see the first thing I mentioned is VRIS, the Voter Registration Information System Database. That is that voter registration database. We have the vote tabulators, which is what I was just starting to describe. We have electronic poll pads, which are basically the electronic versions of voter lists. We have the AutoMark, which is the accessible ballot marking machine that is available during any in-person voting sessions. And then there's also something called OmniBallot, which is an secure electronic voting portal that is available for voters who need accessibility accommodations to vote by mail, or voters who are military and overseas citizens voters. Now, the ones that are probably the most salient to talk about today are the precinct tabulators. So I'm sure many of you who vote in Harwich or in other communities are familiar. We have these tabulators set up at every precinct. This is what you put your marked ballot into once you have checked in, marked your ballot, and checked out. The very last step for voting is to place your ballot in this tabulator. This is the machine that reads how you've marked your ballot to produce results. So this is what you'll see at the precinct level. We also use something called a high-speed scanner, and that is something that allows us to process early voted ballots in larger batches. So when we're processing these early ballots, we're opening the envelopes, we're removing the ballots in batches, we can process 50 to 100 ballots in about a minute or two using the high-speed scanner, whereas this takes probably 6 or 7 seconds to process one ballot. So it's a great piece of technology, seeing that we have this higher volume of early voted, either mail or in-person ballots. But what you see most often is this precinct tabulator. All election equipment used for vote tabulation does have to meet certain federal standards. It has to be certified for use by the Secretary of State's office, and then once it is acquired by the local community, it is tested in advance of every election. So any piece of equipment that we use in election must be tested in advance so that we can verify that it is producing accurate results. So for example, for the state primary election that will take place on September 3rd, the town clerk's office completed pre-election equipment testing this past Friday, August 16th. So what we do is we mark what's called a test deck. So that's where we take ballots for that election, we fill in the ovals, When we mark those ballots, we make sure that we account for all different voting scenarios. So we'll leave a race blank. We will vote for more candidates than there are vacancies for a certain race. So let's say it's a vote for one, we'll fill in 2 ovals. We will vote for write-in candidates. We'll make sure that we vote for every candidate whose name appears on the ballot. So that leads to our test deck. So we mark at least 50 ballots for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The state has us mark fewer for the Libertarian Party just because there are fewer Libertarian registered voters and voters on election day, so we marked 10 of those. So we had a test deck that was comprised of 110 ballots for this election, again, voted to account for all of these scenarios. And then we hand count those ballots. So we have spreadsheets that indicate how every ballot was counted to produce kind of the election results for those 110 ballots. And we brought our spreadsheets over if you wanted to look at some of our test ballots and some of our hand counting spreadsheets. So we hand count them so that we see what the results should be. And then what we do is we put all of those ballots into the precinct tabulators, we run the results report, and we check that the results produced by the tabulator match the results from our hand count tally sheet. And we do that for every memory card, every tabulator, the high-speed scanner, the automark, and the electronic poll pads. We test every piece of equipment to ensure that it is producing accurate results, and we do that prior to every election. So that's how the equipment is tested. It's also annually maintained by the vendor that provided it to us and that we're under contract with, so it undergoes regular maintenance in addition to that regular pre-election testing. So we did bring this tabulator with us. We brought 10 ballots from our test deck. So if anyone wants to have the experience of putting the ballots through the machine and seeing it produce results, you're welcome to before you leave this evening. You're also welcome to compare those ballots against our hand count spreadsheet so that you can see Democrat ballot 1 was hand counted this way, and when it's put into the tabulator, it's read this way. So we brought those with you in case you want to kind of see that in real time. I won't spend time doing it because I don't want to take away from having time to answer your questions, but that is something we do before every election. And then this big box, for lack of a better word, that the tabulator sits on top of is called a ballot box. So once the ballot is read by the tabulator, it falls into this box. I don't know how well you can see from where you're sitting, but the ballot box has 3 different compartments. I'm going to bend down, wish me luck. So you'll see it's quite roomy in here. So this is where the bulk of the ballots fall once they're counted. So on election day, this door, again, if you can see it, is closed. The tabulator can identify if a ballot includes any write-in votes. So if you filled in an oval indicating you've selected a write-in, the tabulator identifies that you have written in a ballot, and it segregates that ballot into this smaller compartment. So that way it's flagged for the election workers and staff at the end of the night that there's going to be something on that ballot that needs to be manually tallied. So those are the 2 compartments inside the box. There's another smaller compartment at the back of the box. This is called the auxiliary bin. If for whatever reason, either a marked ballot can't be read by the tabulator, so for example, if you have voted the ballot and you put X's or a check mark in the oval rather than filling in the oval, the tabulator can't read that. The tabulator can only read a filled-in oval. So if you put your ballot into the tabulator, it will read an error message saying ambiguous mark is the error message that it flags if you haven't filled in the oval correctly. If you don't want to correct your ballots, your option would be to correct the ballot, or you can place your ballot into this, you as the voter, place your ballot into this auxiliary bin, and then your ballot needs to be hand counted by election workers at the end of the night. So most voters do choose to correct their ballot, to be issued a new ballot, and to fill in the ovals correctly, but the option is available for voters to place it into the auxiliary bin. This is also more common if voters have voted by mail, so they're not physically present to correct their ballot, but they've marked their ballot with an extra check mark. Then the election workers processing those early ballots on behalf of the voter would place that ballot into the auxiliary bin to be hand counted. If, for whatever reason, there was a technology problem with the tabulator, so the tabulator isn't working, stops charging, there's a power outage, we have spare tabulators, so we would resort to those first. But if for whatever reason there was a technology problem that meant this tabulator was not usable and we couldn't correct it through troubleshooting or with the vendor or with a spare, at that point all voters would place their ballot into the auxiliary bin until we could correct the technology issue. Or if it couldn't be corrected, then they would do that through till the close of polls. And then all of the ballots in this auxiliary bin are hand counted by teams of election workers. So those are sort of the compartments on the box and the way the tabulator itself works. Does anyone have questions on the machine itself or the box? Yes?
Are they connected to the internet?
They are not connected to the internet. They cannot be connected to the internet. A machine cannot be certified for use if it has the capability of being connected to the internet. Yes?
Do you have the capability of ensuring that it does not connect to the internet? Any devices that you use, or are you just trusting the certification of the machine not being capable of doing that?
So the question was whether we have anything available to us to independently verify as the town clerk's office that it's not connected to the internet. We don't. No, we do rely on the federal standards, the state certification, and then, our testing and certification and interactions with the vendor. There's no tool that we can use with it to verify that. But we do rely on that verification that comes with the certification process. Yes?
My question is not related to that. My question has to do with people with disabilities, like somebody with a very low reading level who can't pick out the names very well. What happens with those?
Sure. So this is a great question about a voter who might need assistance, either reading or understanding the ballot, or locating races or candidates, or potentially even marking the ballot. And there are a few different ways that voters can be assisted. So there's either assistance with people or assistance with technology. So if someone is looking for assistance from a person, they can be assisted by any person of their choosing. They can be assisted by election workers who will work in teams of 2, and the election workers must be registered in different political parties. So those 2 election workers would accompany the voter to the voting booth and could assist them in reading the ballot, identifying the candidates, and even filling in the oval in accordance with the voters' choices. Or we do have that machine called the AutoMark that is available anytime there is in-person voting. So both on election day and during in-person early voting. And this is a wonderful piece of equipment where the voter inserts their ballot. So they check in, let's say it's in person on election day. They go to their precinct, they check in with the election workers, they're handed their ballot. They would then take their ballot to the AutoMark. We have one that is centrally located here in Harwich in the gymnasium, available for voters in all 4 precincts. They insert the ballot into the AutoMark, and then that AutoMark has a number of accessibility features. So basically it takes the material from the printed ballot and puts it on a digital screen. The screen can be magnified. It can be set to high contrast, so black background and white text. And it is also equipped with headphones. So the voter can put the headphones on. They will already be set up with the machine. And the AutoMark can read instructions, races, and candidates to the voter. And the voter can make their selections either via a touchscreen, the screen is touchscreen compatible, or with buttons that are on the ballot. And the AutoMark will confirm what the voter has selected, and it also allows them a chance right before marking the ballot. It gives them a summary of the selections they've made, and they can go back to any race or ballot question if they need to say, oh, it looks like the AutoMark is telling me I selected candidate A and I meant to select candidate B. You can go back to that race and correct your choice. And then the very last thing you do is you click a button that says Mark Ballot, and then the auto mark actually prints and uses ink to fill in the ovals on your ballot that correspond with the choices that you have selected. And then it prints that ballot to you, and you bring it back to the checkout table, and you put it through the regular precinct tabulator. So when we test the tabulator, we ensure, one, that the auto mark works, and it marks the ballots in accordance with the selections we make, and that the precinct tabulator can read ballots that have been marked by the auto mark. So that option is available to voters as well.
I'm glad I asked, thank you.
Thank you. Any other question on election equipment? So I know I talked about the high-speed scanner. Any high-speed scanner is compatible with your precinct tabulator. So for example, the precinct tabulators owned by the town of Harwich are called the Image Cast Precinct 2. When you buy a high-speed scanner, it has to be compatible with that tabulator. So we have an Image Cast Central high-speed tabulator. So that ensures that all of the equipment is compatible with each other and can read the ballots given to your community, printed for your community. So most voters don't have any interaction with the high-speed scanner because they're used by election workers to process the early voted ballots. But I just wanted to make sure if you're there on election day and you see the central tabulation facility we have set up in the gymnasium and you see a piece of equipment rapidly running ballots through, that's what it is, that's what it's doing, and you're welcome to watch if you would like. Any other questions on equipment or any other topics we've talked about today? Yes?
We haven't talked about it, I don't think.
Okay.
So, Emily, how are ballots secured once you receive them from the Secretary of State? What's the process that the town clerk's office goes through to ensure that they remain secure?
So just to confirm, you're talking about ballots that have not been voted, just
Right.
ballots, okay. So Chris's question is about what happens when we actually receive the printed ballots, how are they secured and stored? So depending on the election, so for state and federal elections, the state is responsible for ensuring that the ballots are printed and sent to the town clerk's office. So they work with whomever their vendor is to print enough ballots of every style for the community and to have them shipped to the community. For local elections, that responsibility falls to the town clerk. So we work with the vendor who provides our tabulator, and we send them what the ballot should look like, what races, what candidates, what ballot questions are applicable. They print the number that we order and they send them to us. Once we receive them, we do a couple of things. We verify that all of the information on the ballot is correct. So every office is spelled correctly, every candidate's name is spelled correctly, the residential address of the candidate is spelled correctly and is accurate. So we verify accuracy, we verify quantity, and then they get stored in our vault. So for anyone who is not familiar with the town clerk's office, we have a large vault right inside of our office, so you need the office door key to gain access to the exterior of the vault, and then the vault itself is a large, secure vault with a combination that only town clerk's office staff has. So that is where they are secured until they are either for early ballots mailed, or for election day ballots until they are brought to the polls on election day. They are brought in locked metal containers to the polls on election day. They are transported in town vehicles with a police escort. So if you ever see us at 5 a.m. on election day with the lights and sirens, our ballots and our election equipment is being transported with a police detail. In fact, we had a police detail bring our tabulator over today, and they'll be picking us up to return back to town hall after this event concludes. So we do have that police escort. We do have a police detail at all times at the polls. So that is how they are transported. They're then, voted, and then they return to the town clerk's office in the same way. Either secured in locked boxes because they're voted ballots, or they return to those metal locked carrying cases for transport back to town hall, or they go back into our vault. Great question. Yes?
So the tabulators aren't owned by the town, like you don't have one for each precinct, if you own it, they belong to another company?
So the question was about ownership of the tabulators. We do own our tabulators. So we purchase them from a vendor and we maintain a maintenance agreement with the vendor. So we do have them annually serviced by the vendor we purchased them from. The vendor is also responsible for troubleshooting any errors, particularly on election day within a certain time frame. But the town does own them. We do purchase them following state procurement law. They have to be voted to be put into use by our select board. So we do own them. We own 4 precinct tabulators and 2 spare precinct tabulators. We own the high-speed scanner. We own the poll pad. So we do own the technology. Yes.
It's me.
Yes, you.
How long do you retain voted ballots, and does the state election division ever do an audit of towns?
So the question was about retention of voted ballots and any auditing of election results. So for state and federal elections, we are required to store those marked ballots for 22 months. Don't ask me where 22 months came from over 2 years, but it's 22 months. So we keep them in the container that they were sealed in on election night, barring a recount or an audit. So they stay in those sealed containers, and we just house them for 22 months. They could be opened again in the case of a recount. So a candidate can request a recount of an office that they were running for. Any registered voter can request a recount of a ballot question. So if a recount is initiated by voter or candidate request, those boxes are unsealed again in a posted recount session where the candidates have representatives and is open to the public. But barring a recount, they stay sealed. The only specific audit happens every 4 years following the presidential election cycle, so following the presidential election in November. The state audits 3% of all precincts, so not all towns, but all precincts in the state of Massachusetts. My understanding is that they have literally one of those like bingo ball things that they roll. And so, for example, Harwich Precinct 1, Precinct 2, Precinct 3, Precinct 4, there'll be 4 Harwich Precinct balls in this rolling thing, contraption. I don't know what the official term is for that. And the state polls 3% of those precincts. If your community's precinct is chosen, then you have to do a hand count audit of that precinct. And then the hand count results are matched against the results produced by your tabulator to verify accuracy. So that's the specific audit process that happens following a presidential, so it will happen this November. But that's the only time a specific audit happens.
Who will determine when it's time for a new tabulator?
So the question was, who determines when it's time for a new tabulator? It's something that is, I would say, decided by the town clerk's office in consultation with their select board and finance committee and town meeting voters, because there is a high cost associated with them. So we just acquired these ImageCast Precinct 2 tabulators in the fall of 2023, following a town meeting appropriation in 2022. So thank you to the voters for that support. So it does require an appropriation of funds. And so I'd say town clerks pay attention to, are these machines working well? Are they producing accurate results? Has any of the technology changed drastically to warrant changing equipment, upgrading equipment? I'll say, so the first election we used these new tabulators for was the March 2024 presidential primary. Prior to that, we used something called the AccuVote tabulators. And I think these are a significant improvement. They provide more information to the voter on the screen. For example, if the voter makes an error, they seem to jam less frequently. In fact, we haven't had them jam at all. So I think we would pay attention as the clerk's office to, is the technology evolving and are our current machines working well? And if we feel that it's time to make that change, we would pursue the appropriation. If, for whatever reason, it is possible for a machine to lose its certification, so again, the machines are certified at the state level based on their compliance and testing to federal standards. If for whatever reason a machine was decertified, of course that would place some urgency for acquiring new machines. I'm not aware of that happening at any time in recent history, but it would prompt something more timely. Other questions? We are past 6 o'clock, so I don't want to hold anyone over. I do see another question in the back.
Well, if everyone's going to leave. Thank you for doing this, but you mentioned a few times about you would reject a ballot. Can you just tell us what that means and where the rejected ballot goes, or when I accidentally make checks instead of bubbling, where that ballot goes? Thank you.
Yeah, so this question was about rejected ballots. Ballots can be rejected at a few different stages. So if a ballot voted early, either by mail or in person, it would be rejected if, again, the voter didn't sign the outer envelope, the security envelope, if the voter didn't seal their marked ballot in the security envelope, if we find that the voter returned this ballot to us and then moved out of town, so they were no longer eligible to be a registered voter in the town, we would reject their ballot because they're no longer eligible to cast it. So those are cases where an early voted ballot would be rejected. Those ballots are all still retained, stored and retained by the town clerk's office. We have designated rejected ballot bins that are also stored in our secure locked vault by precinct. They are rejected in the voter registration database with the reason they were rejected. So again, if your ballot was rejected, you get a rejection notice from us. You can call us and say, when and why was my ballot rejected, and we have the documentation to describe that reasoning to you. And we also have the rejected ballot. So that's what happens with the early voted rejected ballots. The other question, that was part of the question, was ballots voted on election day where, for example, the tabulator couldn't read them. So if a voter fills in their ballot with X's instead of ovals, they're talking to the election worker and they're given the chance to correct that. What happens is they do something called spoiling that first ballot. So it's not called a rejection when it's on election day, it's called spoiling. They spoil that ballot. The spoiled ballot is returned to the election workers at the check-in table. It is placed in a designated, it's written spoiled ballot in large red letters on the front and back of the ballot. It's placed in the dedicated spoiled ballot envelope, and then the voter is issued a new ballot to mark correctly, to fill in the ovals, for example. And then they cast that ballot. The spoiled ballots are collected at the end of the night. They remain in their precinct-specific spoiled ballot envelope. They are transported back to the town hall, and they are also retained for 22 months, or 30 days if it's a local election.
How do you prevent duplicate voting? In other words, someone lives out of state, they've done a mail-in ballot, but someone else goes to the table, since you don't have to prevent any proof of who you are when you step up to give your name and address, and they give the person's name and address that they know is not here.
So the question is, how do you enforce, is that the right word? Maybe
Detect or figure out that, I go and vote at my neighbors because I know they're not here. I know their name, I know their address. I walk up and I say, I'm John Jones of 304 Cedar Road.
So I would say, so a voter, to verify, when you check in on election day, you're required to provide your full legal name as registered and the residential address where you're registered. You are not required to provide ID except in those very few circumstances. So the question is, what stops someone from fraudulently checking in as someone else if they have reason to believe that that person has not voted themselves, checked in themselves, would not be checking in themselves?
In person.
In person.
They could have voted by mail.
So that's,
Or not voted.
I would say, so that's what I would say, is it would be a very high risk activity for that individual to undertake, because, so this is the poll pad, I keep pointing at it and I realize I haven't explained what it is, I'm just gesturing. So this is the poll pad, this is the electronic version of the voter list. So this is what election workers use to check voters in on when they come on election day. This is where they enter in the information, your full name and your residential address when you check in. And this will include, so it will show if someone else has already checked in under that name and address in person, or if they have already voted by mail or requested an early ballot. So all of that information is contained on here. So everything is, because we log it into that central voter registration database, and that database pulls the data file that is loaded into this poll pad, The information is all synchronized and it's always updated in real time. So you'd be taking a risk to say, I believe John Smith at 100 Oak Street has not checked in already in person today, and that they have not applied for or voted a mail ballot. So you're taking quite the risk. And again, if you were to be detected for doing that, that is a felony offense that would be prosecuted by the district attorney's office. And we would not hesitate as the town clerk's office to refer that for prosecution to the district attorney's office. The other kind of safety mechanism for that is that observers on election day have the option to do something called challenging a voter. So any observer, and this could include an election worker, an election official, if they were observing this happening, can say, so when you go to, so let's say John Smith goes to check in and they give 100 Oak Street as their address. Someone observing, again, including an election official, could say, I challenge that voter. They're indicating that I don't think that voter should be allowed to check in. When that happens, the voter attempting to check in and the person, the observer issuing the challenge, are brought up in Harwich to the information table. In other communities, it might be to a precinct warden. And the observer issuing the challenge has to give a fact-specific argument for why they think that person is not legally eligible to vote. So let's say I'm the observer, Emily Mitchell. John Smith, 100 Oak Street, is trying to check in. I say I challenge that voter. So I, Emily, and either real or fake John, go up to the information table, and I, Emily, might say, I know John Smith, he's my neighbor, this is not John Smith, and in that case, the election official has to make a determination of, and then John Smith might say, I have identification, I am registered to vote at 100 Oak Street, I am who I say I am. So there would be that determination. So, especially in a community like Harwich, where most people are connected with other people in Harwich, and I always think of elections as sort of a social event where people see each other, sometimes for the first or only occasion. It's rare that someone walks into that room and nobody working the election knows who they are. So again, it would be a high risk. You're right that there's no foolproof method to say we verify that every person checking in is who they say they are, but we have these tools available to us where we are quite certain that the people checking in are who they say they are, they're registered where they say they're registered, and they're eligible to vote in the manner that they are checking in. But the voter list accuracy and synchronization for both early ballots and in-person voting, and that challenge process where someone could say, you're not John Smith, you don't live at 100 Oak Street, you're not registered to vote, you're not a U.S. citizen, making any legal challenge to suggest that that person can't lawfully check in and cast their ballot, that process is available for determination.
All that trouble would be avoided if we had voter ID.
I'm not going to make any commentary about various things. I'm only here to speak tonight to what the election laws currently are.
Yeah, I know.
Yes. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? I will just remind folks that the state primary election is September 3rd. Polls are open here at the Harwich Community Center from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. We will have in-person early voting at Town Hall, designated from the Town Clerk's office, 732 Main Street, beginning this Saturday, August 24th. We're open from 10 to 4 for purposes of in-person early voting. And then also Monday through Friday of next week, August 26th through August 30th, 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. each day. And you do still have the option to vote by mail. If you've already received your mailed ballot, you can return it to us anytime up until the close of polls on election day, so 8 p.m. on September 3rd. If you're interested in voting by mail but have not yet applied, you can still do so until Monday, August 26th at 5 p.m. We have to receive your completed application by that date and time. So we hope that you will choose to vote in one of those methods, and we look forward to seeing you on election day. Thank you.